Every few years, there's a Pokemon fan game that takes the community by storm. When a project gets finished, pretty much every YouTuber and player in the community jumps in. But there are cases when this happens to games that aren't completed, which is especially interesting when you consider the number of players who refuse to play unfinished games. But of course, I believe that anyone can be swayed, if the game is good enough. And that game is Pokemon Unbreakable Ties. In this video, I'm going to be both showcasing the game's features, writing, and visual appeal, while also reviewing each aspect as I go. But I want to make it clear that everything I say in this video will be 100% honest. Most of my experiences with games that the community has highly praised haven't gone so well. So while my expectations for the game are very high, I'm still going to be fair, as I don't want to just sound like someone trying to be different, just to be different. But let's not waste any more of your time. This is Pokemon Unbreakable Ties, the fan game that almost everyone has been talking about. Before we continue, I'm sure many of you watching have potentially thought of playing a monster taming game outside of the Pokemon series. But with the number of options and the risk of buying something you might end up not enjoying, most people have abandoned the idea. That's why I'm here to show you a game called Dokimon, which just so happens to be the sponsor of today's video. Dokimon is a monster taming and battling game, taking inspiration from the Game Boy Color era of games to give you a truly nostalgic and retro experience. In this game, you'll be able to explore a world made of 15 different towns with tons of routes, caves, and forests in between them. There are over 140 unique and original monsters to capture, train, and battle with. One thing that certainly separates Dokimon from many other monster taming games is the option to have battles in either the classic turn-based scene you're used to, or right in the open overworld, a feature that definitely took me by surprise. But Dokimon is actually available to purchase and play right now, and if you want to learn more about it, be sure to check out my video on it or the official Steam page in the description below. I almost never start with the story when it comes to reviewing an individual fan game, but because the plot is just so integral to the overall experience, I figured I'd make an exception. In the opening cutscene, you're introduced to both the tropical region of Akevia and the main antagonist, who seems to possess a power that can block any type of Pokemon attack. After that, you get to take control of your player character, learning from your parents that becoming a Pokemon trainer is a dead-end job that will get you almost nowhere. Obviously, for the sake of this being a Pokemon game, this issue is immediately resolved when you receive your starter Pokemon and begin your adventure with your two childhood friends. I think the thing Unbreakable Ties does the best with its storytelling are the cutscenes. There are a lot of them, but unlike most fan games, rather than just characters standing around and talking to each other, the situations are conveyed using portrait art, animated overworld sprites, a hint of voice acting, and Pokemon sprites borrowed from the Pokemon Mystery Dungeon series. Everything is told in a way where you don't have to think too hard about what's going on, and the readability of the characters and Pokemon's actions really help that. But there is a very high level of spoon feeding, which, if you don't know what I mean by that, it's basically the author spouting out obvious details that would normally be left up to the reader to think and theorycraft about. Most of this was done with one character's backstory in particular, making their situation a bit less exciting. But for some reason, this problem just disappears after the third gym badge is acquired, which is interesting because that's kind of the point where myself and many others I've spoken to find to be the point where the game's story gets increasingly better. Speaking of the characters, this game has a very nice cast of them, and honestly does a really good job of making sure each one gets their moment and development in the story, and it doesn't get forgotten about. One of my biggest pet peeves in a Pokemon story is when gym leaders or whatever other progression-based bosses you're using just get ignored once you're finished battling them, which is usually really lame, because it always feels like there's more of a story to tell with their character. But luckily, that isn't a problem here. But there is something that does kind of bother me with the story, and I wasn't sure whether to include it here or in the gameplay segment. It's the forced starter that you're required to keep in your party almost 100% of the time. And look, I've played enough games where your starter is picked for you, or they just hand you an Eevee and call it a day, but in those situations, I could always just box them and use something else. But honestly, this is more of a personal nitpick than criticism, so I guess it doesn't really matter too much. Finally, one thing I didn't really want to judge was the translation. Because yes, this is a Spanish fan game, and the English translation is not from the official developers themselves. But I will say that it really wasn't bad, and it had a lot more effort put into it than many other fan translations. Okay, now let's move on to the most important part of any Pokemon game, and that's the gameplay. You see, I like a good story, and I like a fun cast of characters. But if you give me all that and put no effort into the gameplay, then I'm probably going to have a bad overall experience, no matter how good the writing is. The Akebia region is very exciting to explore, with a collection of diverse routes that don't feel super straightforward, with their different paths leading to different items and trainers. But I also never found myself getting lost. While the first half of the game mostly takes place in a tropical area, I didn't mind the lack of biome diversity with how the routes were put together, but I'll talk more about those later. Something that stuck out to me about each route was the tall grass being very easy to avoid, and since caves only had Pokemon encounterable via the dust pile, no place felt annoying to explore, and repels were completely unrequired. One thing that did bother me about the exploration was that there were a lot of towns you travel through where you just do one thing and leave, which to me feels kind of stupid for that town to even exist if you're just going to spend 2 minutes there and never come back. Like, at least have a unique store or place of interest that gives the player something to do or something to come back to. But the most important part about gameplay for me is the Pokemon battles, or the difficulty. Now, this isn't actually my first time playing this game. I played it for about 2 or 3 hours when it first came out, but quickly gave up with how easy it was. Obviously, this isn't going to be a problem for most players who just want a good story and nice looking graphics, but I actually want somewhat of a challenge. And mashing A through every fight got boring incredibly quickly. However, just recently, a new update was released that immediately revived my interest. This update in particular added difficulty options: easy, normal, hard, radical, and a special Nuzlocke mode. I went with radical mode, which the game basically explained to me was incredibly difficult and highly unrecommended if I wanted to have a good time. Now, was that actually the case? Nope, not at all. Sure, it was definitely more difficult than before, and I didn't get bored in any of the battles, but I was still able to deal with just about any issue and found myself an undefeated trainer with barely any of my Pokemon fainting. And it's not like I had a box full of Pokemon to rotate in and out, nor did I EV train my entire team. I literally just put together a team of 6 with decent coverage, and that was enough. That doesn't sound too bad for a normal Pokemon experience, but this game mode specifically told me that I was in for a wild ride, and I got nothing close to that. But enough with the negativity, because Unbreakable Ties does have some interesting gameplay features. A handful of quality of life is offered to the player, with the EXP All, portable BC, and an item that can heal your entire team, that receives more charges over time. But on top of the already amazing Pokemon diversity, with nearly every Pokemon in the series being available to capture, is the Poke Gacha. You insert a ticket, and you get a Pokemon. It might suck, or it might be really good. It's all up to chance. The final gameplay aspect I wanted to mention were the gym puzzles. I feel like this isn't a topic that gets talked about enough in Pokemon games, but the gym puzzles were probably some of the most unique ones in the series, fan-made and official, and they were unique in an actually fun way, not something I was trying to figure out for an hour, or had to look up a guide for. Let's move on to the final point, and that's the graphics. I've said it 100 times, Spanish fan games are no stranger to good visuals, and Unbreakable Ties is no exception. Maps are very well put together with tons of different NPCs, overworld Pokemon, and overlay effects. Every corner of every area really has something for you, whether it be an item, a collection of Pokemon, or an NPC with something to say. But as I played, I noticed something very off with the art style and direction of the game. And let me try to explain what I mean. Having almost every Pokemon available in the animated style was really cool, but the backgrounds were all insanely inconsistent. Some of them were well put together, some of them looked like they could use some work, but almost half of them were just blurred images of the backgrounds from the 3DS games, which combined with the base plates felt very jarring to look at. In most cases, it felt like it would have been more effective to have just used the obviously better looking pixel art backgrounds in multiple places rather than struggling to have one for every unique area. Now, I know, this is a stupid nitpick, and it's one a lot of people aren't going to care about. But as someone who spends most of their game development time creating maps and assembling custom assets, it's something that stands out to me. It's something that bothers me. And it's something that's never even going to be considered to be fixed by the developers if no one says anything about it. Besides those nitpicks, however, the game is still very pretty, and I still had a lot of fun exploring the different maps despite that. Something I didn't really focus on in this review was the character art, because while most of them are pretty messy, the developer has voiced that they are getting replaced and improved, so it didn't seem worthwhile to criticize the existing ones. But that's going to just about wrap up my review and showcase of the existing game. With my scores for each aspect available on screen, the final score for my overall experience is going to be 8 out of 10, meaning I enjoyed 80% of what I played. But I have a feeling that as the game continues to be updated, that score is going to go even further up. And I want to say that I'm going to try to be more accurate and honest with my rating for future reviews. Because in my last one, I gave Xenoverse a 7 out of 10, and I definitely enjoyed Unbreakable Ties way more than just by 10%. But be sure to subscribe for more Pokemon fan game and ROM hack recommendations, showcases, and reviews. And if you want to find out how to actually play this game, then be sure to check out the video on the top left or in the description below. But I hope you all have a nice rest of your day, and goodbye!